We are going to start the screencast with the bullet Justification of Slavery by the Planter Elite. And these are just some examples of how slave owners might justify owning slaves during this time. So our first example is referred to as paternal benevolence. Not spelled on the slide, but what that means is that many slave owners saw themselves as paternalistic or father-like to their slaves. They saw themselves as a father figure to their slaves. And this is because they provided food and shelter to the slaves. And so they felt that they were taking care of people who, without them, would not be able to take care of themselves because they wouldn't be capable. The second justification used is the Bible. And this is kind of surprising, but there are examples in the Bible of the Hebrews, who were God's chosen people, owning slaves. And so they think that because it's mentioned in the Bible and God's chosen ones did it, that it's ethical. And then lastly, they do refer to it as a necessary evil because their economy depends on this free labor system. Now, slavery was very different throughout the South, depending on where you were. So these two regions are referred to as the Upper South or the Cotton South. We'll start by discussing the Upper South. So life in the Upper South was easier for the slaves. The crops that were planted and harvested in the Upper South were usually rice and tobacco. And rice and tobacco were not in high demand like cotton was. So the plantation owners could not afford to overproduce their crop. So they allowed their slaves to work using a task system, meaning that each slave would be given certain jobs to do for that day, and once their assignment was complete, they were finished. And so they were not as overworked. Now, life in the Cotton South or the Deep South is a very different story. Cotton was in very high demand, and the U.S. is supplying most of the world's cotton at this point. So the goal of the plantation owners is to raise as much cotton as possible to make as much money as possible, and then they can just afford to buy more slaves. So slaves worked from sunup to sundown. And cotton was also a demanding crop. Slave owners tended to be more brutal to slaves living in the Deep South or the Cotton South. Okay, marriage and relationships. There are many cases of slaves marrying each other, but it was more ceremonial because slave marriages were not recognized by law. Families are often separated, which is really sad. So even if you were married, that didn't mean that you could not be bought or sold at any given auction. Okay, resistance. Many slaves, and we talked about this before, practice silent forms of resistance. such as breaking tools or working more slowly to cost the plantation owner money. So that's still happening. And large-scale revolts are very few and far between. Slaves know they don't have the numbers to be successful in leading an uprising. And the slave owners did fear resistance, but they knew that they had the numbers to put down any kind of rebellion, so they would just be sure to threaten and punish bad behavior and try to scare the slaves out of wanting to resist. And the last thing I want to talk about today are free African Americans. And so these are African Americans who mostly living in the more northern states where slavery is outlawed. There are some cases of freed slaves in the South, but they always had the risk of being recaptured. So first of all, just an overview. Free African Americans did have difficult lives. Okay, even though they are free, they are seen as socially inferior to white Americans. So they often had to work jobs that no one else wanted. Most of them were not allowed to vote. Very few of them owned land. You see public segregation, so they're not really allowed to participate in the normal aspects of white society. And there's always that risk that they could be recaptured and resold into slavery. Owning slaves. There are few, but some cases known of free African Americans owning slaves themselves. And even some who would eventually support secession, but you don't have to know that. But this is very, very rare, but it did happen. Most free African Americans did recognize the bond that they had with other slaves, and so they fought for abolition, and they fought for freedom. Okay, so most of them will not participate in owning slaves or supporting slavery themselves. Alrighty, we're going to stop here, and we're going to start tomorrow with abolition. Write down any questions, and I'll see y'all tomorrow.